Hello and welcome to our interview with Her Excellency Julia Gillard, the first woman to head the Australian Labor Party and the first woman Prime Minister of Australia. Welcome, Julia, to the project.
Thank you very much.
We know that you talk about yourself as driven, as having a strong sense of purpose and as having an ambition in politics. What is it about politics that drove you, that satisfies you, that pleases you?
The thing that politics gives you, and it certainly gave me, is the ability to see a problem, make a decision to change it, implement the policies that do change it, and then be able to look back and prove to yourself that the change you were seeking has actually happened. And there is a grand delight in that, being able to have the power, the levers in your hand to address long-term issues of disadvantage and inequity. For me, the most satisfying bit was around creating a better education system, because it was trying to improve the quality and equity of education that first motivated me to get involved in anything that looked like politics.
And it was through education, wasn't it, that you became involved in politics? You were involved in student politics. And you've also recommended that that's a good way to make a start into political life. What was it about student politics that got you involved?
My experience in student politics meant that you not only had the ability to learn how to develop a policy and raise your voice and make change, but you learned some really practical skills about managing staff, managing budgets, self-organisation, what it means to wake up in one city and organise yourself to travel to another city, to go to a meeting or give a speech. It gave me an insight into the corridors of power, what influences politicians. So all of those skills actually came in handier in my later life in some ways than the academic learning of my law and my arts degrees. So I'd certainly recommend to students that whilst you should study hard and make sure that you get that qualification, that campus life, university life, can give you a whole series of opportunities to learn and to test these other skills that will matter so much in the long term.
So education and changing what was happening in education drove you into politics. Were you able to do what you wanted in terms of changing education around issues of equality?
Not everything. I think the work of reform in an area like education is never done. You've got to come back and do it again and do it again. I mean, how we conceptualise education, what are the modern equity issues, how we make sure that standards keep improving, that curriculum keeps up to the demands of the modern world. Of course, these things have to be continuously laboured over. But I'm satisfied that we drove a real change in early childhood education, lifting quality as well as making it more affordable. In school education, better transparency, a more rigorous focus on quality, national curriculum and much fairer funding. And in post-school education, more transparency, more funding driving better quality and a better view about equity and access.
And that education has stood you in good stead. You said you were involved in politics, but also it's important to study for your qualifications. You talk about yourself as purposeful, having a sense of mission. Is it safe to say that you didn't become Prime Minister just as a series of accidents?
It wasn't a series of accidents, no. I mean, politics is an unusual profession in which effort in and reward out can actually be not correlated. I mean, you can imagine a circumstance, looking back in my Labor Party's history, the Australian Labor Party's history, there have been periods of time when we were out of office for a long period, and you could have been the most talented, most able politician, but not have the opportunity to bring your skills to a government front bench. So there are some things about the political times in which you live, some circumstances about luck that do make a difference in politics. But with all of that, you need to do the work and you need to have the skills and attributes that enable you to be someone who is recognised by the people who support you need, the vast electorate, the voters of Australia, as well as the people within your political party, as someone who should rise and get more and more responsibility.
And you were, of course, the first woman to head the party and to become Prime Minister in Australia. And many people know about you that famous misogyny speech, and that will forever be associated with you, for good or bad. I think a lot of women have taken heart from that. But what people may not know so well about you is what else you've done around women's equality. And you were involved in drafting the party's commitments on affirmative action and in setting up Emily's List. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Certainly these were very important things for the Australian Labor Party. We lived through an era where there were more and more women coming forward in Labor governments, state Labor governments, and particularly a woman called Joan Kirner, who led a government in the state of Victoria. And I was quite a young party activist at that point, and you looked up at the Labor government and it was led by a woman and there were all of these women ministers, and you could really believe that, you know, this is the change, it's here and it's always going to be like this now. But we ultimately suffered a very bad election defeat, and when you looked back, the women had tended to be in the marginal seats, the ones easily lost in a bad election, and we were pushed back to a smaller caucus in which there was only one woman. And with that experience, Joan Kirner in particular set out to lead a change in the Labor Party so that there would be an affirmative action rule which required the party, when it was doing pre-selections, to make sure that there were women in the safer seats as well as the seats that were genuinely at risk in an election campaign. And then Joan also threw her energies into creating a Labor women's organisation called Emily's List. To be a member of Emily's List, you needed to be pro-choice and pro-equity. And on that basis, then Emily's List would assist you with the fundraising work necessary for a political candidate, as well as skills training and mentorship. I, as a younger activist, got to work alongside Joan and a series of other women in the development of these two things, the affirmative action rule and the creation of Emily's List, and both have been very successful to support women in the Labor Party.
That must have been an incredibly exciting initiative to be involved in at an early age. And now looking back, do you see it's been effective? Can you see what difference it's made?
I certainly can see what difference it's made, and there's a real contrast when you look at, say, our federal parliament between the number of women who serve in the Labor opposition as it is now, or who served in the Labor government alongside me, including at the most senior levels, compared with our Conservative opponents who have never adopted a similar set of changes, never had an affirmative action rule. So when the new government, the Conservative government led by Tony Abbott, came to office, there was a period of time when there was only one woman in cabinet. Now that has become two women. But it is because the Liberal Party, our Conservative Party, has not really focused on these issues, that they lack the critical mass of women in their parliamentary organisation.
There are many women who feel that they don't want to go through affirmative action or reserve places or quotas for fear that they won't be recognised for being in it for their own talents and their what they bring to the conversation, rather that they're selected for being women. Presumably you hear of that too in your work. What's your response to women who want to go into politics and feel they don't want to be selected simply for being a woman, in inverted commas?
Yes, I've certainly heard that, and the model we adopted with the affirmative action rule, the way it's worked generally, different states have had slightly different adaptations, but for example in the state of Victoria, where I was a Member of Parliament, the way it worked was you would have your pre-selection round, and then you would look at your pre-selection round and see if you had selected enough women. And if you hadn't, then you needed to have the whole pre-selection round again. And for a political party to do its pre-selections twice is such a huge thing that, of course, everybody made sure that there was enough women in the first round. In these merit-based arguments, I've always put the view, and genuinely believe it, that if you think merit is equally distributed between the sexes, I certainly believe that. And you look at any structure, a political party, a parliament, a cabinet, and you're basically not seeing half men and half women, then the people of most merit haven't got there. So we shouldn't say somehow pre-selecting women is counter to the merit principle. Actually, disproportionately pre-selecting men is counter to the merit principle.
Absolutely.
And if we haven't got enough women coming forward, then we need to think about what are the barriers in their way and how can we clear those barriers out of the way. One of the barriers in the Labor Party, going back before we had the affirmative action rule, is it was a party with a lot of male networks, many men in Parliament, many men in the trade union movement. When they thought about the next likely political candidate, they tapped their networks, which were male networks, and produced the next man. And the affirmative action rule made everybody bust beyond that business as usual model and look more broadly.
Right. But even when women get there, as you did, got into Parliament, rose to the highest ranks of your party and of government, you were subject to sexism. What you said now that you've left office is that that sexism came a little later than you expected, and you wish that you'd called it out earlier than you did. Would your advice be to women who do follow into seniority to call it out sooner? And if so, how to deal with the consequences? Because naming sexism while you're trying to pursue a career is not an easy thing to do. It comes with a cost, as you know very well.
Yes, I do, and
Yes.
it's a complex set of judgments here. The error I think I made is I assumed when I came to office as the first female Prime Minister that the maximum reaction to the first woman would be there in the few months after I got there. So the maximum, feminist, go girl, that's fantastic, we finally got a woman reaction.
Yeah.
And the maximum of the sexist, I don't want a woman leader, I don't feel comfortable with a woman leader, this is all unusual, it's not sitting well with me. I thought all of that would sort of play itself out in the first few months, and then it would normalise, and I'd get on with being Prime Minister and be judged solely through the prism of doing a good job, doing a bad job, agree with the policies, disagree with the policies. What I actually found was the longer I was Prime Minister, particularly as the government got into more and more controversial issues and terrain, that the gendered insult became the convenient sort of go-to weapon in these political debates. And so by the time the sexism was very manifest, it was hard to disaggregate in the public discourse what was being driven by gender and what was being driven by the fact that a number of these policies were just controversial. If in the early days I'd set out to say, no, that is gendered and let's pursue our conversation in a different way, perhaps that would have been received more genuinely than at the later stage when things were already controversial, people having the easy retort that she's only pointing to sexism now because she's in choppy political waters. Now, for an individual woman on the way up, day by day, how to make those judgment calls, I don't think that there's, one size fits all, one rule that will work in every circumstance. But I would certainly advise to think about it earlier, to not assume it's just going to normalise as a natural consequence, and to try and find the strategies to deal with it earlier. Not all of that burden should lie on the shoulders of the women who are trying to make their way in politics or business or whatever it is. It seems to me much of that burden should actually lie on the shoulders of men. And I think it would have been very powerful when I was Prime Minister if someone, say for example from the business community, a man in the business community had actually said, look, I may not agree with Julia Gillard, I may not be intending to vote for her, I don't like some of her policies, but we don't have our democratic conversations with this gendered set of insults in the middle of it. I think, that would have been very, very loud in the Australian political debate. So looking to mobilise the male champions who can help change things is important too.
So 2 points there. One is in determining the strategies that women can use when they're subjected to this sort of abuse. There are presumably the networks like Emily's List and other women in the same field who you can call on to think through when to challenge and how to cope with the challenges of challenging. But also, ought we not, as you say, to mobilise men's support?
Our Sex Discrimination Commissioner in Australia, a government appointment, a woman called Liz Broderick, has done a fantastic job in creating a male champions for change structure so men can come and be identified as the kind of men who want to see genuine equality in corporate Australia and Australian workplaces. I think that there's probably a political equivalent of that can be thought about and mobilised to help take some of this burden of naming and shaming sexism off the shoulders of women directly and at least make it a shared burden.
Right. And one last question, Julia. Those women who want to follow you, who've taken inspiration from you, who want to be the next woman Prime Minister of Australia and possibly elsewhere, will be looking to you to learn from your experience. What message would you give them?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say go for it. In conversations like this,
Yes.
we do talk about the gendered part, and so we should, because
Yes.
we're never going to resolve these issues unless they're researched and thought through and the subject of discussion.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want people to take from discussions like this that it's too hard or too gendered and to turn away from politics. The ability to bring change, the delight of doing that, outweighs any of these negative factors by an absolute country mile. So I'd first and foremost say go for it.
Yeah.
I'd say be very clear about why you're going for it, what the sense of purpose that is driving you is. Politics is a business in which you do need to know why you're there, what you want to do, and it will be that sense of purpose that sustains you, whether it's education or health or the environment, whatever the issue, whatever the cause, it will be that sense of purpose that sustains you. And I'd also say nurture a sense of self. You will be the subject of criticism, including gendered criticism. You can't afford to let your sense of who you are be hostage to media cycles and twists and turns. Yes, you should always respond to constructive criticism, but you know, the cruelty that can happen on Twitter, some of the harshness in the media cycle, you can't let that corrode your sense of self.
Sense of self that brings the delight of change, a phrase I've heard you use a couple of times, which is a wonderful point on which to end. Thank you, Julia Gillard, for your time.
Thank you very much.